Hello, everyone. Just closing everything down. Yeah, welcome to the Start Central seminar. How do I get the slides where I want them? So today's speaker is Peter Humburg. He's one of our consultants here, and he's going to be talking about what to do with your large p-values. But before I let Peter start, I'll just flick through these slides that have been playing, just to let you know a little bit about Stat Central in case you haven't met us before. We offer free design advice to all UNSW researchers. And design and analysis advice to HDR students. If you find our website, you can book a consultation with us. We also do grant reviews and reviews of ethics proposals. And we run short courses and these monthly seminars. We also can be contracted to spend some time on projects in your lab or unit that might go for a week or a day or longer. Our next courses are coming up. We've got our sample size and power calculation course coming up in March. And these dates will be confirmed imminently, but in May, we're expecting to run our suite of courses on Introduction to R, Introduction to Statistics in R or SPSS, and also Introduction to Regression Modeling. So keep an eye out for those. And these are just some other events that you might like to be aware of. So I'm going to stop sharing that. And I should have introduced myself. I'm Eve Slavich. I also work at Stat Central. You ready to go, Peter?
Yep. Yeah, thanks, Eve. I hope you can all see my screen now. Yeah, so I'm Peter, and I would like to talk a little bit about things that you might do when you end up with large p-values, which always is a bit of an unpleasant surprise. So I'm sure, well, you've either experienced this yourself or are afraid it might happen, that you've run a study and then in the end, you do that test to decide, whether there was a significant difference, whether your treatment worked or whatever it is you're doing. And the p-value turns out to be larger than the threshold you've set, 0.05 or whatever it may be. And that's very disappointing. But that doesn't mean that all is lost, right? It doesn't have to be a disaster and sink your study. You can still learn something from your data. And in fact, as we'll see, you might be able to learn quite a lot from your data. And in any case, really, regardless of the outcome, you should try to publish your results, right? We hear a lot about publication bias, where only significant results get published, and there's sort of a big hole in the literature with the non-significant results just missing. And that's obviously bad, right? You don't want your efforts to go to waste, and also you want really people to know that this didn't work, so the next person doesn't have to try again. So what should you do? Well, before we sort of dive into that, let me reassure you that it is possible to publish non-significant results, and just so you don't think that I'm just making this up and I'm just, overly optimistic and telling you, oh yeah, it doesn't matter, you can publish anyway. But in reality, every journal will reject your paper. I've dug up an example, right? So this is a paper that was published in Nature. And what happened was that this group was investigating sort of the effect of microbial microbial environment in the placenta on pregnancy complications. And the assumption at the time apparently was that that is a thing, right? So that there's maybe bacterial infections and they cause complications. They did a study and they didn't find anything, right? There was hardly any bacteria in the placentas they collected, and there certainly was no difference between their group with complications and the control group. And they went ahead and published it anyway. There were several non-significant p-values involved, but that didn't stop them from getting published in Nature. So just because your p-values are not significant, don't give up. There's certainly things you can do. But just saying, well, my p-value was large, larger than 0.05. And so now I'm going to publish a paper saying that there's no effect. That's not enough, right? That's not quite how it works. Because that's just not what the p-value is telling you, right? If you're looking at the p-value from your analysis, what it tells you is how likely it is to observe an outcome as extreme as the one you did observe if the null hypothesis is true. And it doesn't tell you anything about how likely it is that the null hypothesis actually is true. It also doesn't really tell you anything about the size of the difference and whether there's enough difference between your groups to matter in any way. But it still can be a useful summary of the amount of evidence that you have against your null hypothesis. But of course, the problem is that if it turns out that there isn't all that much evidence against the null, then you are kind of stuck, right? You did your experiment, you checked, and well, there wasn't really enough evidence to say that that difference you were looking for exists. And that's it, right? It doesn't really tell you much more. And that by itself is clearly not very exciting, which is why you might be feeling a bit disappointed. But let's take a look at a sort of more concrete example to see what maybe you can do. So for this, I will be looking at some penguins from the Palmer penguins data set, which you can get as a sort of example data set. It contains data for, I think, 3 different penguin species in a few different islands. I'm only looking at Adelaide penguins on 2 of these islands, Biscoe and Torgerson. And here, obviously, we want to compare something, right? We want to test for some differences. And just to keep it simple, I will take 2 of these penguin colonies, and we will look at how their flipper lengths may or may not be different. So here you have a histogram of those flippers. And Well, maybe they're different, maybe not. But let's pretend that our hypothesis is that the penguins on Torgerson have longer flippers than those on Biscoe. And that's certainly something that we can test, right? And looking at the data, we can see that the mean flipper length on Biscoe is 188.8 millimeters, and it's 191.2 millimeters on Torgerson. So that seems like, well, they're not exactly the same, right? But if you want to investigate this a bit more rigorously, you might do a t-test, for example, to compare the two. And so we can go and do that, which then gives us a p-value of 0.074, which is not significant at any sort of threshold you might commonly use. And now we're feeling sad. But really, all we've done is here we've looked at the p-value, right? And that's not all there is to our data. And it can't be everything, right? I mean, it's a single value summary of an entire data set that can't possibly tell us the whole story. And so really, regardless of how this p-value turns out, you probably want to look at the effect size as well. And kind of consider what that means, right? What does the size of the difference mean? Is it large enough that there might be something interesting going on? Maybe even if the p-value wasn't significant, is there, some evidence that there is an interesting difference, but we just didn't have enough data, maybe? Or is it really, is the effect we observed so small that it looks like there's really nothing going on? So we can look at the data and the estimates we generated from it a little bit more, right? The first thing we might look at is the estimates of the mean flipper lengths in these two colonies that we get. And here I've plotted these. It's still 188 and 191, but of course there is some uncertainty, right? We haven't measured all the penguins, we just measured some. So what the actual mean of the population on each island is, we don't quite know. And there is a fair bit of variation, so it's hard to be entirely sure. And if you look at these, these confidence intervals I've plotted here, then you'll see that there is a fair bit of overlap between the two, right? So that already suggests that maybe they are not as different or as easily separated from each other as we might have hoped. And the thing we really care about is the difference between the two, right? So this is the mean difference with its 95% confidence interval. And as you can see, the difference is not nothing, right? It's about 2.4 millimeters. But again, the confidence interval is reasonably large. It extends up to just above 5, and a little bit below 0, which is where we get our problem, right? Because a 0 difference, which would correspond to both of them being the same, obviously is kind of plausible based on our data. And that is consistent with the p-value we've got. Right? Okay, so we know there is some difference, maybe. That's, well, we have a slightly clearer picture of what might be going on now, but maybe not really quite enough to get excited about this. So to better understand what might be going on and to be able to interpret this difference, we really have to think about how large does the difference have to be for us to care, right? What's of the minimal important difference? And that is something that you ideally think about ahead of time. And then once you know that, that provides some context for the data you found. So returning to the penguins, what would we consider to be a sort of minimal difference in flipper lengths to get excited about? Well, I have no idea. My knowledge of penguins extends about as far as knowing that they're kind of cute. So I don't know what a biologically meaningful difference in flipper length is. But for the purpose of this example, let's say we start caring if it's about 5% of the mean flipper length, right? Which would work out to be 9.4 millimeters or so. And so now we have a number we can work with, right? So now we have something that we can compare the difference we observe to. And in this case, it seems pretty clear that a difference of 9.44 millimeters is rather larger than the difference we observed, right? And so that's something, right? So now we are getting closer to being able to say that actually maybe there really is no difference. So having established this of minimal difference, we'll need to be able to say there is an effect that actually matters, helps us to make decisions like that. And we can turn that into a proper test to decide whether there actually is no difference. And sort of to get there, we can use the sort of minimal difference we've established, 9.4 millimeters or so in our penguin example, to create a region around 0 where we say if the difference we observe falls into this region, then this is a difference so small that it's basically the same as 0 for all practical intents and purposes. So I don't we often call that a region of practical equivalence. And we can then take our estimate and its confidence interval for the difference and compare it to this region of practical equivalence. One of several things will happen. It could happen that our estimate and confidence interval just fall outside that region of practical equivalence, which would suggest that there is an actual difference. Sorry, MID is minimal important difference. And so if that happens, the green case here, then that's all good, right? We found an actual difference, it's large and all is great. The sort of worst possible outcome you might get is that actually we get a result that suggests that either no difference or a difference that is large enough to care are plausible, and we just aren't able to decide based on the data we have. And so that's the red case here where your results are inconclusive, and that is a bit more difficult, obviously. And then there are two other cases where we end up with differences that are too small to get excited about, but where the significance tests for the difference being different from 0 may or may not be significant. In both of these cases, you might decide that really what you found is evidence that the difference is just too small to matter. Okay, so that's kind of useful now, right? This gives us a more sort of detailed view of what's going on and what our data allows us or doesn't allow us to say. And we can use that to perform an actual test, an equivalence test. One way to do this, I mean, there are different approaches to equivalence tests, but a quite simple one is the two one-sided tests approach, which basically has you starting out with sort of your region of practical equivalence, basically. And then you do two tests. The first one looks at the lower boundary of that region and tests whether the difference we observed is larger than that lower boundary. And then the second test looks at the upper boundary and tests whether the difference is smaller than the upper boundary. And combining those two results, you can then decide whether or not your data provides evidence that your estimate lies between those boundaries, which is the green region here, which would then suggest that there is equivalence, right? So no effect, basically. So the question is how to calculate the minimum important difference. You don't calculate it, you know it, right? So you have to consider the problem you're studying and what that difference means. And so you have to use your domain knowledge to decide how large a difference has to be of any sort of consequence. And then, of course, if you do all those tests, you can also get p-values if that is something you care about. And it can be nice to attach a p-value to your results, right? So what I've done here, I've used the toaster package in R. And that allows you to run all these tests. There's 3 tests here. The first one is our t-test that we did initially. And you'll see the p-value of 0.076 again. And then we have the tests for the lower and upper boundaries, each producing their own p-value. And you can then go and combine evidence from all of these tests into a conclusion. So in this case, the tests would tell you that the null hypothesis was non-significant, as we saw, right? So we didn't find enough evidence to suggest to reject the null hypothesis that there's no difference in Fibber length. But the equivalence test was significant. And you'll note that here I'm reporting the larger of the two p-values. And yes, here this is this one. And together, these then suggest that there is actually fairly strong evidence that the difference in flipper length is less than 9.44 millimeters, which was the sort of minimum difference we decided was of relevance to us. And that's a pretty good result, actually, right? Because now you are not just saying, well, I didn't really find a difference, but there may or may not be one, and I don't know. You can actually say, actually, I'm quite sure that there is no difference. So now you can go and publish it. Great. And actually, if you come up with good evidence that there is no difference, you should be able to publish that just as well as you would have been able to publish a result if there was a clear difference. And many journals will accept papers that do just that. I would say that you should, of course, like always, be cautious to rule out any sort of mishaps in the process, either during data collection, processing, or analysis that might have led to results that are incorrect, right? So that can happen whether you test for equivalence or a difference. And especially if you were very much expecting to find a difference and then there suddenly is none at all, you can get a bit suspicious, right? And probably should get a bit suspicious that something might have gone wrong. In our example, for example, I could have, maybe I labeled the penguins incorrectly and got the islands all mixed up. And so whatever difference may have existed was wiped out. Another great way to get no difference between groups is if you have a sort of treatment and a control group, but you fail to apply the treatment, you probably find that there is no difference, right? So be careful that everything went right, and if your results are unexpected, be extra careful. But if you did everything right, then finding equivalence is a result that's just as good. But that still leaves us with the case where your results were inconclusive, right? And that's clearly more difficult because you didn't really have enough data to decide or whether there was an effect or not. And that's obviously more difficult to publish because what you're saying is, well, maybe I didn't plan my study properly. And that's generally not a great argument, right? But that doesn't mean that you should hide your data or your study. Other people may still benefit from it. It might form part of a future meta-analysis and contribute a little bit of useful information. And also, it's useful to know that this study was too small, right? So future studies probably should be larger. The data can still be used to generate hypotheses for future studies, your own or other people's. And it will definitely be useful when you go and set out to plan your next study to maybe figure out whether or not this difference exists after all. Which brings us to the fact that, of course, you should plan your studies carefully, and that doing so can help you avoid ending up in a situation where you have inconclusive results. And a really important step there is to make sure you have sufficient sample size. in the process of determining what sample size you'll need, you will almost certainly have to consider a sort of minimal important difference that you'll be wanting to detect with sufficient power. And that will be rather handy if you then later need it for an equivalence test. So, these two things are closely related, and you benefit from thinking about it carefully at the outset. Similarly, if you are in a situation which is quite common, right, that you just, there is a limit to how much data you can collect. There's only so many people you can recruit in the time you have available. So your sample size is somewhat fixed, right? Then it can be useful to consider what sort of effect size can you detect with sufficient power. And that will then essentially sort of define your minimal important difference for you. And you can then consider what sort of rope region, what's this interval around 0 that would lead you to conclude that there is no meaningful difference, how large that is, and whether that makes sense, right? And that way you can then put boundaries on sort of the effect sizes you can detect, and consider whether it makes sense to run the study if there is if that region around 0 is that large. And sometimes it is, and sometimes maybe it is. If you are worried about then publishing your results afterwards, regardless of the outcome, it may also be helpful to pre-register. There are journals that will offer you to basically review your pre-registration, and if that all looks fine, then you run your study, and afterwards they will publish your results regardless of what they want, more or less anyway. Sorry, rope is the region of practical equivalence. I only mentioned it briefly before, I think. But that's the region around 0, where if your estimate of the difference falls inside that region, you're basically saying the effect is too small to matter. Yes, all right. And most importantly of all, when you set out planning your study, talk to a statistician as early as you can. It will make your life easier because you get some help in the planning, and it will make your life easier later because you're more likely to have a well-planned study that doesn't lead you to difficulties like inconclusive results at the end. So, really talk to a statistician. And obviously at Stat Central, we are there to help you with problems like that. And as Yves said, we're also gonna have a sample size and power calculations short course coming up soon that you can register for if you want to learn about that aspect of things. And that's all I have. So maybe we have time for a few questions.
I have one to get you started, Peter. Would you say that whenever you get a large p-value, you should go and do an equivalence test?
Yeah, so I mean, of course, I would say that you probably should say what you're going to do at the outset, right? But to me, it seems like a reasonable plan to say I'm going to test for this difference, and then if it isn't significant, I will do an equivalence test to see whether I can establish that really there is no difference that's larger than this, or whether I can't decide. I mean, these are two cases that seem important to distinguish between.
There's a great question in the chat from Diane Vanderwaal. What's your opinion on significant p-values while by eye the difference is barely visible?
Yeah, right. So that's the sort of situation here, maybe, if I can find that figure again. Or here, right? So that could be a situation like this here, where we have a difference that's significantly different from 0. So the p-value is small, but the actual difference is also quite small and maybe way too small to actually matter. So in those cases, a equivalence test might also be useful, because it can you might not even need a proper test, right? If you decide what a sort of minimal effect size is beforehand, then you can say, well, yes, that was significant and that's great, but it's not as big a difference as we would need to say that this matters. And then so you decide that, yes, it's significant, but it's of no practical significance.
There's a few more questions in the chat. Sorry, there was one that came through during your talk about how you define the minimal important difference.
Yes, so you will have to decide based on your knowledge of the thing you're studying, how large a difference has to be to matter. And I mean, that varies widely from field to field, right? And what it is you're looking at. But often you do have some sort of sense of what would be considered meaningful, and at what point maybe it's so small that, yeah, maybe it's different, but nowhere is going to be able to tell. But it's, yeah, most of the time, I think there are not necessarily clear-cut answers. Depending on the field you work in, sometimes there are guidelines, right? So you have, like, in sort of medicine, sometimes there are established standards, right? At how much of a change is considered sort of clinically meaningful, and you can work with those, but often they just aren't, and you have to kind of use your own understanding.
Did you want to ask your question, Sally?
Oh, look, I was just going to share a current dilemma I've got, which is why I've attended this seminar. I'm in population health. We're working with a program that runs, a social enterprise that runs programs in schools. Very, very tricky to do good pre-post surveys. But what's interesting is that people who've worked with this organisation before have reported significant differences, which now that we haven't found them in this round of data collection, we're looking at the fact that basically the previous significant differences weren't actually meaningful. So it really speaks to what you're talking about. So the cutoff for problematic kind of on this psychosocial measure, that the pre and post were too similar, even though they had a large enough sample to say it was statistically significant. In fact, it's now making us question, is this measure useful for this population? Because they're starting off normal, so therefore, why would we expect change? And then also, you know, we've got another measure we've been using, which is a new measure, but it doesn't have, like, we've gone back to the authors and said, well, what's a good level? And they don't actually know. So again, when you're choosing measures, particularly in the psychosocial kind of arena, thinking about that meaningful difference up front and going, well, what are we hoping to see? And it's really made us think a lot about what are the constructs we should be measuring? What's the program logic? So I'm thinking of writing a paper about the challenges of this work and how do you choose a measure, and you know, what's meaningful in this context. And it's also making us think about the length of the program. Is the program length long enough to actually shift certain psychosocial measures? So there's actually a lot to learn from the fact that we haven't found anything significant. I mean, the organisation, we're going to try and give them something like you can show a few things increase, but not statistically. But it's making us really question the robustness of the measures and the evaluation and the program. And that's important. We shouldn't just bury it and go, well, there's nothing significant. So it's really come home to me lately like this. I'm really interested in trying to work out the practical equivalence question for the measures we're using where there isn't clinical kind of cutoff saying that's normal, that's not. But it's an area that I think we do need to publish more in because it can improve evaluation and study design.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think you're quite right. And I do think it is very helpful to try and think about these sort of differences that you would need to find beforehand. And in some cases, you know, maybe also think about then whether you're measuring it in the right way to be able to find those differences. And yes, I think those are all important considerations. And I mean, you said that some studies were published that found differences there, but it's also quite possible that there were a lot of studies that didn't find any and they just didn't publish, right? So it's, and I think it's important to kind of try and fill that gap. And talking about it sort of in terms of, you know, sort of mere important differences and, you know, equivalence can help you get it published. And also maybe can help to sort of, you know, move the conversation along towards, you know, what should we be doing and is this the right approach?
Yeah, I agree. So watch this space. I might be coming to you for some advice.
I don't know, did you want to pick a question from there's a few still there, Peter. There's one that's where would you pre-register?
All right. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And so I think there are different venues where you can pre-register. The Open Science Foundation has a website and there's a database of registered studies that they maintain. And so you can submit your study there and with analysis plan and everything. And that's useful to then be able to point to it later and say, we published this beforehand and this is what we said we'd do. And then we did that analysis and that's how it turns out. As I said, there are also some journals that publish registered reports. If you want to go down that route, I think you have to register with that journal. So there's a process involved where you kind of submit your protocol and it gets reviewed. And then, if the reviewers are satisfied that this is a sensible study, then the journal will agree sort of in principle to publish your results once you have them. But obviously that involves getting in touch with them before you do the study and sort of register there. And yeah, so I'm not sure what the exact process there is. It might differ a little bit from journal to journal. But in general, I think the sort of Open Science Foundation is a good place to go if in doubt. And that's kind of well established, and people, so if there's enough weight behind it that people will believe that you actually did this at the date it says on there, when you get back to it later to publish.
Jesse's asked how you perform an equivalence test. Yeah, right. So I mean, I did try to explain the sort of the basics sort of how you can do two one-sided tests. If you use R, there is
well, there's several packages actually, but I find this toaster package here to be fairly convenient. When you do, well, so it does t-tests, it does correlations as well, and maybe a few other things. But if you use something else, like SPSS, I don't know off the top of my head whether SPSS does equivalence tests. Yeah, so SAS, Nancy says SAS does equivalence tests for t-tests as well. So how to do it easily depends a little bit on the software you're using. Oh, I don't know about Prism.
I mean, in theory, it can be done in anything once you set
Yes.
the
Yes. So I mean, in
Oh.
theory, you can set this up manually, right? So you can do these two one-sided tests yourself. You can tell Prism to do a one-sided test to test whether it's larger than the lower boundary, and then test whether it's smaller than the upper boundary, from which you then can assemble results like this. And so that works. You can do it manually. And depending on the software you use, you might be able to just essentially press a button, set an option, and get the output in one go.
I think, are there any more questions from the floor? There is one last question, but I think it's a bit of an out there one for you, Peter. How did we get to the point where significant values are so idealized?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess we kind of like having clear answers, and being able to say, look, here's one number, and it says, my study was successful. And that's kind of tempting, I guess. But yeah, I guess we have now been working for several years to try to get away from it a little bit and take a more nuanced approach.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you everyone who's come along. It's been great having you all here.